Hey guys, today's game is from the FIDE World Rapid and Blitz Team Championships, Round 9, where Magnus Carlsen gives us a masterclass on how to bully a grandmaster into submission, in this case the young Pavel Teklov, rated right around 2500, who, despite his best efforts to stand up for himself, was just no match for the powerhouse sitting across the board from him and ended up getting completely obliterated by a series of viciously precise tactical blows and a forced mate on the board before move 30. But you gotta give him props for effort. Powell with the white pieces, kicking off the game with e4, going hard like Bobby Fischer right out of the opening, not one bit afraid of Magnus Carlsen's Najdorf Sicilian because he's got a secret weapon. Which is a secret for a good reason. Instead of playing knight to c3 in this position like you're supposed to, controlling the d5 square, he goes for an early g3, trying to beat Magnus at his own game, playing odd opening moves, but Magnus knows just what to do. He is the king of odd openings, and he immediately strikes in the center with d5, and just walks right into Powell's extensive home preparation, as evidenced by the fact that Powell's next 7 moves are the engine's top choice. So for the rest of the opening, Magnus is basically playing against Stockfish, and it continues with knight to b3. Powell trying to seduce Magnus with a free pawn on e4, which would result in his loss of the right to castle after queen takes d8, and a pawn structure which would not exactly be a picture of health. Magnus says no thank you, simply develops a piece, hitting e4, allowing the pawn exchange on d5, not afraid of the isolated pawn that results. Both his bishops are ready to jump into the action. Bishop to g2, Powell completes his fianchetto, he's ready to castle. Knight to c6 from Magnus, Powell castles. Always best to get that king to safety when you're sitting across the board from the strongest player on the planet. Bishop to e7, Magnus preparing to do the same. Knight to c3, hits that pawn on d5 a third time. Magnus defends. Bishop to g5 from Powell, saying let's remove one of those defenders of the d5 pawn, but Magnus just castles. He knows that Powell ain't winning jack, because if white were to take on f6 and that knight is replaced with a bishop like so, if you go after d5, the bishop is going to be sniping that pawn on b2. And Powell, being a grandmaster, has seen this as well, which is why he defends the pawn now with rook to b1, throwing the ball back to Magnus, threatening to win that d-pawn. What are you going to do now? I'm going to push it, says Magnus. I'm attacking your knight on c3. Come at me. If you take on c6, I'm going to take on c3. And if you take on b7, I'll play rook to b8. And if you take on a6, I'll play queen to b6, hitting your bishop, who would love to transport himself back to the g2 square and help defend the kingside, which is now looking a little bit like Swiss cheese, but can't. Powell says, no way is this worth the extra couple pawns, way too dangerous against the Magnus, which is why in the game he instead went for knight to e2, just targeting that d-pawn with another piece, and Magnus responds with the top engine move, h6, which by the way is why home preparation with the engine usually doesn't work on Magnus, because he can just find more engine moves over the board than you can memorize, which is what seemed to happen here. Powell now looked one move into the future and saw that after bishop takes f6 and bishop takes f6, the pawn on d4 would again be defended thrice, and he would have given up the bishop pair for no reason at all, hence the move bishop to c1, which is a very respectable move, nothing wrong with it, but it looks a little timid, which is enough to awaken the inner bully in Magnus Carlsen, and he says, I don't like the way you look. I'm going to get aggressive with bishop to c4. Pinning your knight to the rook on f1, and we're going to fight after school. But Powell knows how to deal with bullies. He has been coached by his dad, who told him, don't back down, stand up for yourself, and they'll leave you alone. So he strikes first with bishop takes c6. Now as black, if you want to have some fun here, you can play d3. The point being, after c takes d3 and bishop takes d3, you're hitting the rook on b1. But Magnus apparently doesn't like that kind of fun, or he just didn't see it, and instead simply recaptures on c6, which is a pure pawn sacrifice, which Powell now accepts with knight b takes d4. He can't wait to go home and tell his dad how his anti-bullying training worked. Although he shouldn't get too excited yet, Magnus does have ample compensation for the lost pawn. and he is not done pushing around this young grandmaster. We now have queen to d7, getting ready to double up on the d-file with the queen and rook battery, maybe get a pin going on both of these knights. Powell correctly concludes that the bishop on c4 is not sustainable. He goes green with the only move in the position that doesn't lose, b3. Got to get that bishop out of there. It drops back to d5, eyeing that extra holy Swiss cheese around the white king. Powell says, I don't really like you there either, and he plays knight to c3. Now we have rook a to d8, the top engine move from Magnus. He is happy to replace his bishop with the queen after it is dispatched with queen takes d5. The knight on d4 is hit, and it's pinned, so it's defended with bishop to b2. Not bad, although after bishop to c5, the knight is hit again, and Powell is forced to block his bishop's diagonal with the move c3. And in case you're wondering what happens if the knight were to move, I'll show you a couple quick lines. If you play knight to f3, that runs into queen h5, a discovered attack on the queen, and after queen to e2, there comes rook f to e8, and the horsey on f3 is in serious jeopardy. Black has way too much activity now. White has no defenses that will work. You can investigate these defensive tries if you want to, or you can just take Stockfish at its word and we will move on. If you want to try knight to e2, that's going to also go down in flames after, as you might have guessed, bishop takes f2 check. And you better take with the king, lest you lose material with queen takes d1. So king takes f2, but here comes knight to g4 check, king goes to g1, and then there is the devastating queen to h5. The white queen's under attack, h2 is hit, white is completely finished here. But getting back to the move played in the game, the correct c3, Magnus now responds with knight to e4, wants to go to g5 and target those cheesy holes around the white king that we talked about. c4 is a nice move by Powell, hitting Carlsen's queen so that he has no time to win the knight on d4. Queen to d7, eyeing up the h3 square, looking scary. It's all about those holes, folks. Not trying to be dirty, I promise. Queen to c2 is what we get next from Powell. A great move, an only move, connecting those rooks, attacking that dangerous knight on e4, saying to Magnus, please take on d4, and I'll take on e4, and I'll be a happy camper. But Magnus has no interest in throwing away all the compensation he has for his lost pawn, and simply defends the knight with rook f to e8. Rook b to d1, placing the rook opposite Carlsen's queen, who now slips into the promised land with queen to h3. Again, Magnus is threatening knight to g5, targeting f3 with a nasty checkmate threat after the knight on d4 is eliminated. So Powell's grandmaster brain is screaming that he needs to do something fast, but just what that something is completely escapes him. Powell unfortunately commits a horrific blunder here, but before I show you what he played, let's take a look at white's best defense, which is rook to d3, covering the f3 square so that knight to g5 can be met with knight to f3. You're challenging that knight's position on g5 right away. You're clearing the long diagonal here to the black king so that you'll have a counterattack with queen to c3 in some lines threatening mate. But Powell rejected this line if he ever considered it, and instead played the very unfortunate f3, a fatal blunder, to which Magnus of course responded like a freaking computer with knight to g5. And just to show you how dangerous this move is, let's take a look at what would happen if it was Carlsen's turn to move in this position again. The threat here would be bishop takes d4. Okay, bishop takes d4. You sack the exchange on d4. Okay, then you can sack the knight on f3, because after rook takes f3, rook e1 check will lead to mate, since king to f2 is followed by queen to f1. That is checkmate. So that is what white is dealing with. Powell, sensing the danger, decides to challenge Carlsen's queen on h3 right away with queen to g2, a move that would completely equalize the game if Magnus did not now have the move queen to d7, which of course he finds. A lot of pressure down the d-file now. The knight on d4 is pinned to the rook. Here on d1, it's pinned to the king. The best try in this position for white, although still totally losing, would be the move b4, just giving that pawn back to get that bishop off of that dangerous diagonal. But Powell instead opts for king to h1. So at least his knight on d4 is no longer pinned to his king, but it is still pinned to the rook, as we will see. Magnus now attacks it a fourth time with knight to e6. If you leave that knight on d4, you're definitely losing material, so Powell tries knight takes e6, which unfortunately also loses material in a much worse fashion after a hideously beautiful response by Magnus. Can you guess what it is? I think you can. Yep, you got it. Magnus sacrifices his queen with queen takes d1. Now you obviously can't capture the queen because if rook takes d1, then rook takes d1 check will force white to part with his queen in order to avoid checkmate and will lose the game as a result of his heavy material deficit. So instead, Powell tries knight takes d8, a move that he apparently thought would save him, or maybe he didn't. Maybe he just wanted confirmation that Magnus was too strong to play queen takes d8 and give up his entire winning advantage. Whatever was going through his mind, after Carlsen's next move, he definitely knew that the game was as good as over. And that move was rook to e1, prompting a very appropriate resignation from Powell Tekloff. His rook on f1 is attacked twice. He can't add any defense. If you capture on e1, you're going to get checkmated in 2 moves. You can't move the rook out of danger. Best case scenario, you are getting mated in 9 moves with the following line. h4, got to give that king a square. And then comes rook takes f1 check, king to h2, and then rook f2, winning the white queen with mate to follow in 7 moves. So a beautiful and effortless looking performance by the biggest chess bully alive, Magnus Carlsen, pummeling Powell Tekloff into submission despite a valiant effort to stand up to the Magnus. At the end of the day, that 300 rating point gap was just way too big to overcome. So thank you for watching, subscribe to the channel while you still have the chance, and I will see you next time.